July 6, 2018, 7 a.m. in Washington, D.C. The Trump administration imposed tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods. The decision, reached after months of escalating accusations over trade deficits, intellectual property theft, and lost manufacturing jobs, sent shockwaves across offices, ports, and trade administrations worldwide. The US had earlier warned that it will impose even more tariffs should China retaliate. In Beijing by 3 p.m. local time, just 8 hours later, China strikes back. A mirror response. $34 billion in American goods, now subject to retaliatory tariffs. No negotiation, no pause. For the first time in the 21st century, the world's two largest economies had declared open economic warfare. But this war didn't start in July 2018. It had been building for decades. In factory towns like Dayton and Toledo, in logistics hubs like Ningbo and Shenzhen, and in global summits from Davos to Buenos Aires. The US-China trade relationship didn't begin with tariffs. It began with a handshake. In 1972, President Richard Nixon became the first US leader to set foot in communist China, meeting Mao Zedong. The Cold War was raging, but Nixon saw an opportunity: open up China and tilt the global balance against the Soviet Union. Trade was the Trojan horse. On January 1, 1979, the US and China normalized diplomatic relations. American companies, from Coca-Cola to Boeing, were invited to a China just beginning its market reforms under Deng Xiaoping. One of the key Communist Party leaders who supported Deng Xiaoping's reforms was Xi Zhongxun. In 1979, as the top official in Guangdong province, Xi Zhongxun played a pivotal role in implementing China's first special economic zones, including Shenzhen. He helped turn Shenzhen from a small fishing village into China's third-largest city and the fourth busiest container port in the world. This visionary leader is also the father of China's current president, Xi Jinping. In the 1980s and 1990s, a bargain was struck. The US would give China access to Western markets, and in return, China would liberalize its economy, maybe even its politics. The US first granted China Most Favored Nation, MFN, trade status in 1980, which lowered tariffs on goods imported from China. This status was renewed annually until 2000, when China was eventually granted permanent normal trade relations status, and President Bill Clinton pushed for China's entry into the WTO. US manufacturers outsourced labor to the Pearl River Delta. Retailers like Walmart and Costco flooded American shelves with Chinese goods, driving consumer prices down. On December 11, 2001, China officially joined the World Trade Organization. It was hailed as a win-win for globalization, but the scoreboard told another story. Over the next 15 years, the US lost millions of manufacturing jobs, many in the Midwest. Critics called it the China shock. Towns in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin shuttered. At the same time, Apple, Nike, and General Motors made record profits from producing at cheap Chinese cost and selling at American prices. The value of US goods imports from China rose from about $100 billion in 2001 to more than $400 billion in 2023. In 2016, Donald Trump campaigned on a clear promise: confronting China. By March 2018, that promise became policy. Trump's trade team, led by USTR Robert Lighthizer and Peter Navarro, invoked Section 301, accusing China of forced tech transfers and intellectual property theft. Section 301 wasn't new. It's a Cold War-era trade law passed in 1974 that allows the US to retaliate against what it sees as unfair trade practices. In the 1980s, Reagan used it aggressively against Japan over semiconductors, cars, and electronics. In the 1990s, Bush targeted South Korea, Brazil, and India. Clinton later turned it on China over intellectual property theft. After the creation of the WTO in 1995, the US leaned into that multilateral framework, filing cases against China's subsidies, rare earth quotas, and tech mandates. But after 2 decades of unmet expectations, frustration set in. China hadn't opened up as Washington hoped. In 2002, President George W. Bush imposed tariffs on imported steel, including from China. It triggered global backlash, especially from the EU and Japan, and was ultimately withdrawn in 2003 after the WTO ruled it illegal. Then, in 2009, under President Obama, the US imposed a 3-year tariff on Chinese-made tires after a surge in imports threatened domestic manufacturers. China retaliated by targeting US poultry exports with anti-dumping duties. Obama's team filed more WTO complaints against China than any other administration. They challenged rare earth export restrictions, solar panel subsidies, and state-driven tech mandates. After years of WTO diplomacy without much result, Trump returned to unilateral action, and he used it on a full scale. December 1st, 2018, Vancouver. Meng Wanzhou, CFO of Huawei and daughter of the company's founder, steps off a Cathay Pacific flight from Hong Kong. She's en route to Mexico with a layover in Canada, but she never makes her next flight. At the request of the United States, Canadian authorities arrest her on the spot. No cameras, no warning. Meng wasn't just a top executive. Her father, Ren Zhengfei, is a former Chinese army engineer who built Huawei from a reseller of phone switches into the world's largest telecom equipment supplier. Officially, Meng was charged with bank fraud, accused of misleading HSBC about Huawei's business dealings with Iran. But the timing was too perfect, the target too symbolic. At the very moment Washington was escalating tariffs and accusing China of stealing American technology, it made a high-profile arrest. To many in Beijing, this wasn't law enforcement. It was hostage diplomacy. Just days later, China detained Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, 2 Canadian citizens working in China. The message was crystal clear. For nearly 3 years, Meng Wanzhou remained under house arrest in Vancouver, fighting extradition in court. The saga became a standoff between global powers, with Canada caught in the middle and Huawei's future hanging in the balance. On September 24, 2021, Meng boarded a chartered Air China flight home. For the US, Huawei had been placed on the entity list, effectively cutting it off from American suppliers like Qualcomm, Intel, and Google. The tech war was now official, and Huawei, once poised to dominate global 5G, had become its first major casualty. But Huawei was just the beginning. In summer 2020, the Trump administration labeled TikTok a national security risk, citing concerns that ByteDance, which owns the popular app, could be compelled by Chinese law to share data with the Chinese government. Trump signed an executive order giving ByteDance 45 days to divest TikTok's US operations or face a ban. For a moment, the world's most downloaded app became a geopolitical hostage. It wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a broader US crackdown on Chinese tech companies, including WeChat, Huawei, ZTE, DJI, and SMIC, as well as scrutiny of Chinese researchers and export restrictions. The line between commercial competition and national security had blurred completely. Beijing didn't take long to respond. Since late 2020, the Chinese government has formalized, then increasingly tightened export controls over key rare earth elements. Together, these 17 minerals power everything from electric vehicles' batteries to fighter jets. And China controls 60 to 70% of rare earth mining and about 90% of refining and processing capacity, making it the dominant global supplier. In 2023, China introduced licensing requirements for their export, with a major extension announced in April 2025. The trade conflict has expanded from tariffs to technology and now to critical materials and minerals, with both sides using export controls as leverage. Beijing has chosen to weaponize its most strategic advantage, rare earth minerals. It began with a crash at sea, a Chinese fishing boat colliding with Japanese patrol vessels near disputed islands in the East China Sea. No explosions, no casualties, just twisted metal and a captain in handcuffs. What follows is a quiet standoff that will shake the foundations of global technology, energy, and defense. Tokyo expected protests. Instead, Beijing responded with paperwork. By late September, just days before the detained captain was finally released, Japanese factories noticed something strange. Shipments of rare earth elements, vital for hybrid cars, missiles, iPhones, had vanished. For 45 days, Japanese automakers reported 0 deliveries from China. No official announcement, no embargo, just silence. But the story wasn't so simple. When Chinese customs began quietly freezing shipments, prices exploded. Dysprosium, used in guided missiles, jumped 26 times over the following year. Panic spread. Yet, by December, shipments resumed. The freeze ended as quietly as it began. China never admitted to weaponizing rare earths. Officials denied any deliberate targeting, but the message was clear. And now, 15 years later, one question remains. Where do we stand today? What exactly are these rare earths? And why does even the hint of a supply cutoff still send markets spiraling and capital scrambling? In theory, rare earths are everywhere. In practice, they're processed in one place, China. The United States needs rare earths for one thing above all: power projection. Advanced defense systems, electronic warfare, guided missiles, all depend on them. But decades ago, the US chose to offload the pollution. Now it's stuck with dependency. For Germany and Japan, the story is similar. Both rely on rare earths to fuel high-tech exports. If supply stops, so do their economies. Yes, reserves exist elsewhere: Australia, Vietnam, Brazil, even Greenland. But refining is the bottleneck, and few countries are ready to take on the cost and risk. China, meanwhile, isn't just holding ground, it's expanding. In 2021, it created a mega conglomerate to manage exports, clean up illegal mining, and tighten control over foreign partnerships. Even China now imports some of what it refines, but its grip on the final stage, refining and magnets, is where its power lies. Rare earths, a family of 17 metallic elements with names that sound like science fiction, but with a power that's all too real. They aren't especially rare in the Earth's crust. In fact, some, like cerium, are more abundant than copper. What's rare is finding them in concentrations that can be mined, and even rarer, separating, refining, and delivering them at industrial scale. And without them, modern life as we know it would grind to a halt. Neodymium and praseodymium are the backbone of the world's strongest permanent magnets, used in electric vehicle motors and wind turbines. Dysprosium and terbium are added to these magnets so they can withstand the punishing heat inside a missile or a fighter jet engine. Yttrium and europium. They're essential for lasers, satellite communications, and the red and green colors in your phone and TV screens. In a single smartphone, rare earths are found in the speaker, the screen, and the vibration motor. A single Tesla Model 3 contains about a kilo of rare earth magnets. Without them, the car wouldn't move. And in an F-35 fighter jet, rare earths are used in everything from radar to targeting systems. Without them, the jet can't fly its missions. Rare earths don't just make technology smarter, they make it possible. And here's why they're so strategic. They're almost impossible to replace. There are no simple substitutes, especially for high-performance magnets. And the refining process, it's complex, energy-intensive, and produces toxic waste, including radioactive byproducts. That's why most countries have left the dirty work to others, and only one country has truly mastered it. Today, China refines nearly 90% of the world's rare earths and produces about 90% of rare earth magnets overall. For the most advanced magnets, Japan and Germany remain key producers, but both rely on Chinese raw materials. Rare earths were once lab curiosities, discovered in 1787 in a Swedish quarry, then ignored for centuries. That changed after World War II. The Cold War turned them into strategic assets, lasers for missile guidance, radar for early warning systems. By 1960, the Pentagon was stockpiling them. Then came the consumer tech boom. Color TVs needed europium for red pixels. Rechargeable batteries required lanthanum. By the 1990s, rare earths weren't just for missiles, they were in every home. These elements aren't rare geographically. The largest deposits lie in China's Bayan Obo in Inner Mongolia, Australia's Mount Weld, the US Mountain Pass, Brazil, Vietnam, and Greenland. But here's the catch. Mining is the easy part. Rare earths are found mixed together in trace amounts. Separating them demands 1,000 tons of acid per ton of ore, decades of expertise in solvent extraction, and tolerance for radioactive sludge. Most nations walked away. China leaned in. Starting in the 1980s, Beijing subsidized state-owned refineries, tolerated unreasonable pollution, and banned raw exports to foster foreign investment on Chinese soil. According to a USGS report on China's rare earth industry, China's share of global rare earth production surged from 27% in 1990 to over 90% by 2008. China's dominance in refining was even more pronounced than in mining. By the early 2000s, it had become virtually the only country refining rare earths at scale, as the US and others had largely exited the industry due to high costs and environmental concerns. Deng Xiaoping famously declared in 1992, "The Middle East has oil, China has rare earths," and history has proven him absolutely right. Today, China remains the world's rare earth superpower, producing about 60 to 70% of all rare earths and refining nearly 90% of global supply. Its biggest customers? The United States, the European Union, Japan, South Korea, and India. While China makes most of the magnets, Japan and Germany produce a significant share of the highest performance versions, but nearly all rely on materials refined in China. Since the 2010 supply scare, the West has scrambled to reduce dependency. The US reopened Mountain Pass. Australia scaled up Linus. Vietnam, Brazil, and Africa are being explored. Recycling is improving, but still small scale. Substitutes remain elusive. The challenge? It takes 8 to 15 years to build a full supply chain. And the biggest choke point isn't mining, it's refining. China knows this. It has consolidated its industry, investing in cleaner refining and forming the China Rare Earth Group to centralize control and enhance global influence. Meanwhile, the West is building stockpiles, funding refining, and negotiating new trade alliances. But the numbers haven't shifted much. China still dominates. The world is hooked. Breaking free will take time, and China knows exactly how much leverage it holds. The West is trying to catch up, but unless it masters refining, it has little choice but to negotiate. Here's a possibility. What if the buyers organized? A US-EU-Japan alliance could account for most of China's export market. Together they could bargain harder, invest smarter, and set higher environmental standards. It wouldn't eliminate dependence, but it might rebalance it. Rare earths are just one battlefield in a much larger war, a war not fought with bullets or bombs, but with tariffs, export bans, and supply chain blackmail. This episode is part of our series on modern trade wars. It started with soybeans and steel. Now it's about who controls the elements that build tomorrow. In the next episode, we turn to the crown jewel of modern technology, semiconductors. Who makes them, who controls them, and why they're becoming the single most dangerous bottleneck in the global economy. This is where the rules of global trade go to die. In 2020, the US quietly disabled the WTO's top court. By 2025, semiconductors made sure it stayed so. The appellate body, the final word in trade disputes, hasn't ruled in 5 years. Not because it failed, but because America blocked new judges' appointments, leaving the system hollow. So when the WTO ruled against US tariffs on China in 2020 and again on steel and aluminum, Washington simply filed appeals into the void, then ignored the rulings. But when China challenged America's sweeping chip export bans in 2022, the US went even further. This time, it didn't even show up, dismissing the WTO as not the appropriate forum to settle concerns related to national security. With that move, the US signaled 2 historic shifts. First, the WTO no longer governs global trade. The era of legal mediation is over. Second, when it comes to semiconductors, rules don't apply. Chips aren't just products, they're national security assets, like oil in the Cold War. Stay with us, and you'll understand why something smaller than your fingernail forced the world's biggest power to tear up the rulebook, and what happens next when there are no referees left. In our last episode, we explored China's dominance over rare earths, minerals essential for electric motors, wind turbines, and weapons. But rare earths don't think. Chips do, and they're not so separate. Rare earths are critical for polishing silicon wafers, generating laser beams inside chip tools, magnets inside chip printing machines. Because yes, chips are printed with beams of light and mirrors that can reflect atomic precision. And the machines that do this are built mainly by one company, ASML, based in the Netherlands. ASML's chip printing machines are just one piece of a strange supply chain. There are actually 3 key stages in making chips: design, manufacturing, and equipment. The US leads in design. The blueprints of advanced chips come from just 3 companies: NVIDIA, AMD, and Qualcomm. Then comes manufacturing, the actual printing of chips. Only a few companies can build at global scale. TSMC in Taiwan, which produces about 68% of the world's chips, Samsung in South Korea, Intel and Global Foundries in the US, and more recently, SMIC in China. But at the bleeding edge, there's really only one, TSMC. Over 90% of the world's most advanced chips, 3 nanometers and below, come from this single company. TSMC's only serious rival at this level is Samsung, but Samsung also designs its own chips, which makes some clients wary. Intel, after years of delays, is now trying to catch up, but ironically, it's also a customer of TSMC for some of its own chips. Others focus on older nodes, useful for cars, rotors, and appliances, but far from the bleeding edge of AI and advanced military systems. And guess who buys most of the chips? China. As of 2023, China consumed over 30% of the world's semiconductors. But TSMC doesn't do it alone. Enter the machines, the tools that print the future. The only machines capable of producing cutting-edge chips below 5 nanometers are called EUVs, extreme ultraviolet lithography systems, and they're made by just one company, ASML. Each EUV machine costs over $200 million. Building one takes a global effort. Optics from Germany, lasers from California, and materials from Japan and South Korea. It's one of the most complex industrial machines ever built. But not all chips need bleeding-edge tools. For slightly older nodes, from 7 to 65 nanometers, manufacturers use DUV machines, deep ultraviolet lithography, the predecessor to EUV. DUV is still dominant in the global market. It powers the chips inside cars, home appliances, routers, and industrial systems. And it's what most of the world, from China and India to Brazil, still runs on. And here too, ASML leads, especially in the high-end DUV segment, where its main rivals, Nikon and Canon, are years behind in precision and volume. One chip, thousands of steps, dozens of countries. The whole thing is so intricate, it's almost a miracle it works. ASML and TSMC are the choke points in the chip world. Without them, no one gets cutting-edge chips. By blocking access to these companies, the US isn't just trying to slow China down, it's trying to freeze the battlefield. But what's the real concern? Not just China catching up in AI, but China building autonomous weapons systems, hypersonic drones, quantum surveillance network, all without needing a single US component. It's about more than just chips. It's about China challenging the US's military edge, soft power, and even economic model. So the US struck hard. First, it blacklisted Huawei in a spectacular fashion, as we explored in a previous episode. Then blocked ASML from selling advanced tools to China. Then came the 2022 export bans. If a tool uses US components or software, it can't be shipped to China, even if it's made in Taiwan, Japan, the Netherlands, South Korea. And to bring production home, the CHIPS Act is pumping billions of dollars into US fabs, with TSMC, Samsung, and Intel now building new plants in Arizona and Texas. But then came the escalation that stunned even US allies, before Washington slightly backed down. On May 12, 2025, the US Commerce Department issued guidance warning companies that using Huawei's Ascend AI chips anywhere in the world, including inside China, would violate US export controls. The department explains that those chips are likely built using US software or manufacturing tools and used to power Chinese army's drones and quantum computing projects. The move triggered alarm in capitals across the world. No surprise given how wildly global and complex the chip supply chain has become. A few days later, the US quietly updated the statement, removing the reference to anywhere in the world. But the message had already landed. Was it a negotiation tactic from the Trump administration in the heat of a deepening trade war? Possibly. But to the rest of the world, it looked like something else. The extreme weaponization of the global tech system. The unraveling of the very rules-based trade order the US once championed. It was a stark contrast with the open, optimistic image of Silicon Valley, the oasis of innovation, where the best minds from every country once came to build the future, not just American minds. China's tech strategy isn't just about catching up, it's about surviving the squeeze and then breaking free from it. After years of blacklists, export bans, and extraterritorial rules, Beijing has learned the hard way. Dependence is a liability. With over $150 billion in state support since 2014, China is building a domestic chip ecosystem from end to end, dwarfing US CHIPS Act spending. SMIC for logic chips, YMTC for memory, and dozens of firms racing to replace US-controlled design tools, softwares, and manufacturing equipment. In 2023, SMIC stunned observers by producing a 7-nanometer chip for Huawei, without access to ASML's chip printing machines. Not cheap, not efficient, but a signal R&D in China is accelerating. To get there, SMIC repurposed DUV machines based on 1980s technology, proving that sanctions can slow progress but not stop it. And this is just one layer of a deeper shift. With less and less access to cutting-edge chips, China is moving away from component perfection and doubling down on system coordination. It's no longer about having the best chip. It's about building the most resilient ecosystem. DeepSeek's open-source AI ecosystem is one example. The People's Liberation Army's drone swarms are another one. But Beijing didn't stop at self-reliance. China also began to redirect global supply chains. It offered cheap financing to support chip manufacturing in Southeast Asia, the Middle East, and other strategic regions, encouraging the creation of fab networks in foreign countries. At the same time, Chinese officials have deepened tech and trade partnerships with Russia, ASEAN members, and key nations in Latin America, all part of a broader effort to build parallel ecosystems that operate outside the reach of US control. Semiconductors were never just products. From the very beginning, they've powered armies, industries, and ambitions. They've always required state backing because they demand high technology, extreme logistics, and massive capital. They've always been strategic, just invisible. Not anymore. Today, the United States is trying to preserve its edge and contain China, a peer competitor that isn't aligned like Europe or Japan. But China has the capital, the networks, and it's rapidly building the skills to fight back. It's a game of giants. It's been underway for years, but no one knows when or how it will end. As the saying goes, when two elephants fight, it's the grass that suffers. For decades, US policy toward China was built on engagement, the belief that trade would lead to openness and reform. That belief is dead. Trump made the break noisy. Biden made it permanent. Instead of reversing course, Biden, the centrist, escalated. Quietly, methodically, structurally. Here are 3 key moves that confirmed the shift. 1. The CHIPS and Science Act. $70 billion to bring chip-making home and cut reliance on China and Taiwan. 2. Export controls. The US banned sales of advanced chip tools to China and convinced Japan and the Netherlands to do the same. 3. Tariffs. In 2024, Biden raised tariffs on $18 billion in Chinese imports, targeting EVs, solar panels, batteries, and critical minerals. These hikes will roll out through 2026. The names and tones may differ, but the strategic line is clear. America's policy toward China has fundamentally changed, and there's no going back. What began as a traditional trade war over goods has evolved into the most intense economic confrontation of our time. A full-spectrum warfare of supply chains, technology, and leverage. But the US isn't fighting alone, and China isn't backing down. This is the new world of economic containment, where the tools of war are industrial and where dependencies become vulnerabilities. If you want to understand the new rules of global power, follow the supply chains. Don't forget to subscribe, share, and drop a comment.